It's good to be here. It's good to see y'all. It's been kind of a doozy of a week for me. My name's John. If we haven't met yet, I'm the convener here, Valley Mountain. My wife, Freddie, asked me to share with y'all that she misses you. She is in Belgium today at the funeral. Yesterday was the funeral of her godmother. So she shared about it last week, kind of during our open mic, that her godmother was between life and death, and she passed early in the week, and then so now she's with her family in Belgium, grieving together. They were close, and yeah, she just asked for your prayers and your thoughts, and thanks for this community. And I want to say thanks, because many of you have been able to kind of step in during this week when a lot of things kind of went topsy-turvy, and been able to help out. And that's just what Davidson was saying this morning. There's a real village here, and I'm so grateful to that. So, something we were doing together a couple months ago that definitely felt like it was building the village, at least for me, was the Resistance Choir. As Yasmin, did you mention this morning? The Resistance Choir, which was marching in the Martin Luther King parade. And we were at the beginning kind of our march experience, and we were towards the back of the parade, and the parade got stopped right on a corner right outside of Garfield High School. Was anybody there? Yeah, we got a good crew who was there. And does anybody remember the friendly fella on the corner who was trying to help us? Yeah, he had this big Fear God shirt on, and this kind of 10-foot high banner that said Fear God, and he had a bullhorn, and he was shouting at us. And I figured, well, we got competition, so I'm going to try to mitigate that and go talk to him. And also, you know, I want to see who this person is, and it looks like we have a lot of time. So so I started walking over towards him, and he shared with me a number of problems he saw with us marching there. He said, first and foremost, is that God had instituted all authority, and therefore we should obey the government, and protest marching was a form of disobedience to the government, so that was a problem. And then he listed a bunch of other things. So there was, he told me that I worship Mary, that I need to get a real job, that my hair was too long, and that I was probably down with the gay agenda. And I had to say, I don't worship Mary. It's debatable about the job thing. My wife likes my hair, and I'm totally down with the gay agenda. So, you know, hit and miss in terms of your critiques of me. But let's focus right now on the issue we have with this whole governmental thing. So you seem to think that Jesus wouldn't have been out here, you know, marching with people and saying no to injustice when he sees it. You think that he would have been obedient or a patriot or something like that. And he basically said yes. And don't need to go too deep into that conversation. But unfortunately, you know, that kind of behavior is, well, fortunately, that kind of behavior is fairly rare, people just shouting at folks on the street corner. But that theology is very, very, very common. That the entire idea of Jesus and Christianity is basically about one individual's personal relationship and their personal heart state of mind and how connected they are to God. And that is it. That was the whole message. That's the whole purpose. That's the whole faith tradition. It's all about that. And that is primarily this European and American Christianity idea that it is entirely individualistic and it is divorced from politics. And so therefore we should just be good patriots and keep our heads down. Well, I think this is absurd, and we're going to go into a little bit more today. And so today isn't technically Palm Sunday in the church calendar, that's next week. But next week we have this amazing speaker, Shitra Hanstead, who's going to come share about immigrant and refugee situation in America right now, and she's the ED of World Relief in Seattle. So she's going to talk next week, and so I don't want to miss the opportunity to do my favorite thing of the year, which is talk about how Jesus was a political revolutionary, and that's what we're going to do today.
Once a year?
Oh man, yeah, you totally called me out. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of every Sunday, but you know, I guess we get to talk about Palm Sunday, this triumphal entry story where Jesus goes into Jerusalem, and the table turning experience, and kind of really dig into some of that. Thank you for correcting me there. But we really get into that. And I feel like even though if you've been coming for a few years to Valley Mountain and you happen to be here on Palm Sunday, in the past you've heard some of this stuff before, I think it's important to repeat this because it is helpful to have some substance to share when you are in dialogue with people who disagree. And so I was able to talk about some of these stories with the fellow on the street corner. Now, he is not the most receptive of audiences, and some of those people might be in your families and in your networks and communities, but I think it's still important, even just for yourself, to start, when you start wondering, like, why am I doing this? Like, what difference does it make? It's important to have some of these things available to us. And for the past few weeks, we've been talking a lot about kind of that experience of being in between, in the borderlands, in the liminal places in our lives, in the wildernesses, and mostly about the personal experiences of that and how we fear those times of disorientation, of desert, of wilderness, of confusion and wonder. And also how society casts entire groups of people into these permanent liminal spaces where there is no kind of exit plan, there is no end of the kind of the rite of passage doesn't lead anywhere because you are stuck in limbo, such as undocumented people today with no real hope for getting out of that situation. So we've been talking about some of those and how that kind of permanent state of liminality is really destructive and vexatious and problematic and unjust, but how on a personal level that a period of limbo can actually be very powerful. It's something that we often don't want, but it's something that can transform and inform our lives in really powerful ways. And I want to make the case that I think Jesus was somebody who had experienced a great deal of marginality, being in between things, being on the edge, and how that, in some ways, helped him to become the brilliant artist that he was. So Howard Thurman, the great theologian we talk about here fairly often, and one of Martin Luther King's mentors, reminds us in the book, Jesus and the Disinherited, that Jesus was three things. First, he was an ethnic minority. Second, he was a member of a colonized and a conquered people. And third, he was a poor person. He was a laborer. Reverend Seku made that point a couple weeks ago, if you're here for that, saying people think Jesus was a carpenter, but he wasn't like a union carpenter. He didn't have, like, if you look into the kind of the words that are used to describe him, it was more like a laborer. Seku said it's like the guy who knocks on your door and says, you know, can I mow your lawn for a six-pack? Or, you know, like how much can I clear out your gutters for what do you give me kind of thing. Like that was actually more his social class than the sort of the middle class vision of Jesus that we are often fed. So we could also add to these three things an ethnic minority, a member of a colonized people who are living under domination, and a poor person. We could add that he was a religious minority, he was a child born out of wedlock, and that Jesus was a refugee. And in our country right now, with very powerful people talking about building walls and keeping folks out, 45 and all the other ones, and at the same time claiming this absolute love for Jesus, I think it's important to remind ourselves that Jesus was a refugee. When he was born, according to the story of Matthew, there was this mass murdering of infants of his ethnic and religious minority, and his parents fled for their lives away from their home. So they didn't want to leave, you know, it's their home. People don't want to migrate most of the time. People have kinship networks and families. They're not just desperate for that. They often leave because their lives are at risk and their well-being is being terribly threatened. So Jesus was a refugee who was trying to escape this madness in his home country. And perhaps because of all these things, I think he was able to understand the profound power of symbolism, of stories, and of disruptive deeds, and how they can liberate us from our programming and they can spark the social and the spiritual imagination. I took a day off recently, like a real day off. I didn't do anything. Well, I got my kids like dressed and fed in school and all that, but like I didn't do anything on my to-do list. I slept like half the day. Like I took them to school and I went back to bed and I just laid in bed and I kind of woke up and I kept rolling over and being like, ooh, this is so good. And I watched a movie in the middle of the day and I like went on a jog at the park and it was awesome and I felt really guilty. Like this is very confessional right now. I feel very vulnerable telling you this. Please don't give me too hard of a time for this. I felt really guilty about just doing this. I mean, it's like I'm a pastor and the Bible actually has a command saying you have to take a day off every week. And I'm like, it's immoral. to do that? Where is my morality actually coming from? Like, I think I'm so into this alternative morality and values and ethics and way of looking at the world and being in the world, and yet actually there is an entirely different like source informing me what is right and good and what makes me valuable in my life. Even though this is like the thing that I think I'm swimming in, there is something invisible and it's got its claws down inside me. There is a social programming of American capitalist religion, and it has a morality that is way down deep inside me, and I think inside many of us. I mean, I can talk the talk. I can hear people talk to me about it, about the conceptual reasons for living in a different way, but I think it takes imagination and disruption to get out of this colonized mindset. I think Jesus was an absolute master of helping people to develop this imagination and wonder. He was a master of subversive symbolism. These acts that kind of shake people up, and that's what we're going to talk about in a minute with Palm Sunday or the triumphal entry in the turning of the tables. Now, I want to make sure that we're not just talking about like a symbolic action that just makes you feel good. I think that subversive symbolism has some real powerful things that it does. It doesn't necessarily create like a new policy right away. And so sometimes people are like, how is this useful? Because it's not doing anything. Well, I want to share a couple things I think that it does. One, it's a concrete display of moral courage. It shows that you are not afraid. And that actually helps other people to be less afraid too. Second, it breeds dissent. Empires, and I realize I use the word empire a lot here, and people think I'm thinking about talking about Star Wars. So it's helpful for me to discover that. Yes, the word empire, the way I use it, is kind of like the Roman Empire, the Babylonian Empire. It's a structure, it's a system that is kind of the powers that be, usually the economic, military, governmental powers that be. So empire tries to hide injustice. It literally tries to hide it by like not having us see what's going on. And if it can't do that, then what it does is it diverts our attention away from things. We got the smartphones that help us now, like you know, on the train, like nobody's even looking out the window anymore. You're just like this. So it diverts our attention, or it can make something seem so normal that you don't even realize it's a problem. Or it can make it seem like a problem, but it is inevitable and it is unfixable because it's so normal. So subversive symbolism shines a spotlight to disrupt that system that starts to make you consider whether or not things actually have to be the way that they are and that we're told that there's no other alternative. Another thing it does is it engages new resistors. It helps to build a movement. It gets people to start to say, yes, I have power, I have agency, I have something that I can contribute. And that needs to go somewhere. You can't just leave it at symbolic action, but it has some power. So I want to shift now to talking about the actual events of Palm Sunday that we heard Deanza read a moment ago, and the table turning Monday story. So first we'll do it with Palm Sunday. So as you heard in the scripture today, is this an okay spot for this thing? Sorry. Point. Okay. My beautiful handwriting isn't like totally sinking in. I gotta find somebody else for this job. If anybody wants to volunteer a job at church, handwriting. The story is where Jesus comes into Jerusalem. This is Sunday, his last Sunday before he's killed, and he comes first on a donkey. And he comes into the city and people wave palms, or it doesn't even actually say palms in the story. It says they cut the branches off of local trees. So we celebrate Fern Sunday here, because those are the local trees, or bushes, and we can find them. And we actually need somebody to get ferns for next Sunday, so public service announcement. If you want to get some ferns, you can do it. A couple years ago, somebody did the fern thing, and they met their future husband. I just did their wedding, and they talked about how when they collected ferns on Palm Sunday for the church, they fell in love. So if you're looking for love, go help us get ferns. I don't want to guarantee anything, but you know, there's some evidence to show that you get blessed if you help out at the church. Okay. Jesus comes into Jerusalem, and people are shouting and screaming, and they're excited. He's riding this donkey, and he's got his entourage with him, the peasants and whatnot. And then he goes into the city, and by some accounts, by most accounts, he goes to the temple. Some accounts mention that there was nobody there. It was too late in the day, so he comes back the next day. And some don't really reference that, so it's hard to say when exactly. But soon after he goes into the city, whether it's that day or the next day or a few days into the week, he goes into the temple, which is the kind of economic center of the city, or that's what drew people into the city, made it such a hot spot, and really was the driver of its economy. And he starts turning over tables and chasing out money changers, the front line of banking in the city, and inviting in the people who had been excluded. And somehow people often know these stories and still think that Jesus was not a political figure. They think it's entirely a religious thing. And so I want to offer some explanation of some of the symbolism of these actions. So to understand really what's going on here, you got to some degree, understand what the Roman rulers would have done when they entered the city, to understand that what he is doing is revolutionary street theater. So when the Roman Empire would come into the city, first of all, they would come on a war horse or with a chariot. So here's the chariot you can see there. If you can't see this, you might want to come take a look because it's really good. Spent a while on this. This is like third draft. Come on a war horse, big, glorious, powerful beast, or a chariot, something like that. This would be a high up Roman nobility. Second, they would come through the busiest door of the city, which is over here on the west side of the city, close to the king's palace. That was kind of where most of the folks would come in. So they would come to the main, most popular door to show off. Third, they would come with a company of soldiers. Their armed guards would come with them to kind of show might and power. And fourth, they would force people to come outside and to pretend to be happy. These are the colonized people of the land who would be forced to go outside and say, yay, yay, here's our colonizers here. So that's the vision of what it would be like if a high up Roman person came into the town. So we can contrast that with the Palm Sunday story, where Jesus comes in on a colt, a baby donkey that he doesn't even own. It's a loaner. He goes and has to borrow a donkey. Anytime that Jesus needs to use a physical object or money in stories, you'll notice he's like, does anybody have anything? He doesn't have anything. So he doesn't even have a donkey. So he has to go borrow a donkey from a stranger. So he rides in on a loaned donkey. He comes in through the back door of the city, close to the temple. It doesn't say that specifically, but it says that he was on the Mount of Olives before. So somebody who understood the city at this time and was hearing this would have understood, okay, he's not coming in through the door where the main kings would come in through. He's coming in through the back door. Instead of the soldiers around him, he's got fishermen. He's got women. He's got illiterate people. He's got farmers. He's got tax collectors. Probably got prostitutes. This is the company that followed him in contrast to the soldiers. And in contrast to people who were conscripted and by threat of violence against them to go and celebrate, these were people who were authentically enthusiastic about his entry. And so we have this clear kind of lampooning, this making fun, this making a mockery of the emperor and his propaganda of a false peace. The Roman emperor who said, I will give you peace, but at what price? So that's the story of Palm Sunday, and I think it's a profoundly political one. Then Jesus goes into the temple. I don't have a good diagram for this, but he goes into the temple, and he begins, like I said, turning over these tables. To understand what was going on in the temple at the time, here's some info. First, elites were in control of the temple, the religious and the economic elites, with the blessing of the Roman Empire. So there was some collusion there that Jesus was calling out. Second, the temple was the economic engine of the region. Third, it was during the Passover week, which was the busiest tourist week of the year. So this was like the hot time for things to be going on. This would be like going to Westlake Center on Black Friday, which people do in mass. It's really, this stuff works. So to disrupt commerce in the center of the city's economic region during the busiest week of the year, and specifically to pressure and attack, basically, the money changers who are the face of banking. And not only to do that, but then, it's this one verse which is so easy to miss, and it says that the blind and the lame came to Jesus, and the voices of the children were shouting out. Jesus doesn't just say no to something that is unjust. He says yes to a vision of justice. According to Leviticus, this is a book early on in the Bible, kind of the early laws of the Jewish people. Leviticus 21:17, it mentions that people weren't supposed to have blemishes if they wanted to be priests. So the blind and the lame, so to speak, could not be priests. Later on in the second chapter of Samuel 5:8, there's a verse that says that the blind and the lame should not enter the temple. Now, most scholars say that this was actually kind of this was a hyperbole, and it was kind of commenting on something else that was going on at the time. And so, unfortunately, over time, the religious institution took this one thing out of context and created an entire exclusionary system based on it, which, we never do. And at that time of Jesus, people who had these disabilities weren't supposed to be coming into the temple. They were excluded. And of course, children are basically thought of as throwaway creatures at the time. So Jesus not only chases out the people in power, disrupts commerce in the center of the city, and the symbolic action shines a spotlight on injustices going on of his oppressors and also among his own people that he is a part of. Jesus was a Jew. He wasn't throwing down the Jewish religion. He was trying to lift it up in the best heart of it. He also brings in those who had been excluded. This is the heart of symbolic, subversive symbolism. I got to share this with a lot of this stuff with some teenagers earlier this week. I was at a gathering of about 12 different high schools in the area and some middle schools too, on a social justice day, and I got to lead a workshop on faith-based activism called it Disruptive Spirituality, and sharing this stuff with the kids, and the kids were picking it up. I have so much hope from being in that classroom. Yeah. They weren't kind of like, what are you, this guy talking about? They're like, yeah, give us more, like help us figure this out. Like we want to stop gun violence. We want to stop racial profiling. We want to stop environmental destruction of our planet. And we're trying to figure out how we can do this. And so we were having these amazing conversations. One of the groups, they were each supposed to plan an action, a subversive symbolic action. My favorite one was one of the groups had different interests, was focused on racial injustice. Most of the kids of color in class joined this group, and they came up with a plan to go to Charlena Lyles' house, which is a woman who was shot by the SPD a number of months ago, and that they wanted to wear hoodies, have a rally where they were wearing hoodies and holding butter knives, because apparently she was holding some small kitchen knife when she was shot, and that was used as justification in the officer getting off. And that was the kids, totally their idea. I was kind of offering them some questions, some guiding questions, but they were the ones who were coming up with this and being like, and then the news is going to come and they're going to see this and people are going to realize like what's going on and how it feels to be us. And there is hope, my friends. If you are a depressed progressive, there is hope, especially in our youth. I think I want to close by pointing out a couple things that folks who are more progressive or liberal often fail to grasp. It's something I struggle with too. First, that this vision that Jesus was casting in this is one of the first shall be last and the last shall be first. And that's not the same thing as being inclusive. Yes, there was exclusivity in the city, but being inclusive isn't enough. It's a big liberal buzzword right now, and I hear liberal Christians saying this all the time, Jesus was inclusive. But this isn't inclusion, this is revolution. What Jesus was doing was disrupting a system in that there was a cost to that disruption. Inclusion has an air of assimilation to it. It's like, y'all can come in and be here as long as you give up everything that actually distinguishes you from us. As long as you act just like us and talk like us and dress and everything like us, and you don't give us a hard time for all that old stuff, then you can be included. Most of all, inclusion stinks of seeking reconciliation without reparations. And that if we want to go beyond inclusion, there has to be a reckoning. There has to be some real, honest unraveling of what has privileged those of us who have it. To take on this colonial mind and colonial spirit, we've got to break it down and get down into the center of our society and of our own hearts and our own souls. The challenge is on a personal level to go down deep into those places where empire is still inside of you. To find the things that are so normal that you act them out, even while not believing in them. And so my prayer is that we might be able to create as a community, not just on our own in our own minds with our own willpower, but as a community, relying on something greater and ancient and powerful, bigger than us, that we could find those places and let ourselves be disrupted, that the spirit of the humble God could enter through the back gate of our hearts and cleanse the temples of our souls, that we may have an inner revolution as well. Amen.